A road line is being drawn toward one of Queensland's strangest stone ridges. 5 kilometres northeast of Gympie at Djaki Kundu, the ground rises in stepped terraces like a rough pyramid pressed out of sandstone. And by the end of this story, you will know why a bypass route, an old missing report, and one-ton stones have made this place impossible to dismiss. Gympie is usually remembered through gold, timber, wet roads, and green hills after rain. You hear magpies in the morning, tires hissing on the Bruce Highway, the low rumble of trucks heading north. It feels like settled country, mapped country, ordinary country. But just beyond the town, the land lifts into a shape that does not sit easily inside that ordinary picture. The ridge carries stone terraces cut into its sides. They step upward along the slope, catching light and shadow in bands. Some stones feel like the kind you would expect in a paddock wall. Others are far heavier, too serious to wave away with a quick explanation. Stand there, in the heat, with dry grass brushing your legs and sandstone dust under your shoes. And the first question is not dramatic at all. It is simple. Who changed this hill and why? The Gubbi and Kabi peoples are the traditional owners associated with this place, and any honest telling has to begin with that living connection. This is not an empty puzzle waiting for outsiders to name it. It is country, with memory, responsibility, and unanswered archaeological evidence sitting together on the same slope. For decades, one explanation has followed the site around. Vineyard terraces supposedly made by Italian immigrants. That idea traces back to a survey from 1967. But the report behind it is now, for reasons not publicly explained, unobtainable. And that is where the ridge begins to change from a curiosity into an unexplained anomaly. If you want more evidence-led Australian archaeology without wild claims, subscribe now, because the stones themselves are about to complicate the official story. To see why that missing report matters, you have to slow down and look at the hill as a piece of work. They follow the ridge, wrapping sections of the slope in levels that catch the eye even from a distance. Up close, the sandstone has that dry, gritty feel Queensland rock gets after years of heat and rain. Lichen clings in pale patches. Grass grows between blocks. In places, the stone lines seem broken and tired, as if the hill has been trying to sink back into itself. But the repeated steps still show through. That is the part people keep returning to. The pattern has survived weather, cattle, scrub, and decades of argument. If these were only farm terraces, you would expect certain things. You would look for practical access, soil held where crops could be worked, and a layout that made daily labor easier. Some of that may still be possible. No careful narrator should pretend the question is closed. Farmers across the world have reshaped hillsides with stone, and vineyards can leave strong marks on a landscape. But here, the arrangement creates a harder problem. The higher parts of the ridge appear to carry some of the more pronounced terracing. That is awkward for a simple agricultural reading, because the upper slopes are not the easiest place to build, plant, carry water, or move heavy stone. The structure seems to ask for more explanation than convenience alone. Then there is the profile. From certain angles, the ridge has a stepped pyramidal look, rough and eroded but still striking. The phrase can attract careless claims, so it needs to be handled with restraint. A pyramidal profile does not prove a pyramid. It proves only that the shape is unusual enough to demand proper study, which brings the whole case back to one uncomfortable point. If the old vineyard explanation is right, the ground should be able to show it clearly. But people have looked more closely at the stonework. That is why the vineyard explanation has to be treated carefully, because on the surface, it sounds reasonable. Gympie had settlers, farms, gardens, hard work on steep ground. A person hearing old vineyard terraces might nod and move on, especially if the stones are half hidden by scrub and the ridge is not marked like a famous monument. The problem sits in the paper trail. The vineyard idea was first put forward in a survey from 1967, and that survey became the quiet foundation for how the place was explained afterward. Yet the report itself is now unavailable to the public, with no clear reason given. You can almost picture the archive room: cardboard files, dust on the edges, a catalogue entry that points to something you cannot hold. That matters. In archaeology, an explanation is only as strong as the evidence people can inspect. If a site is said to be agricultural, then the notes should show why. Were there grape traces, farming tools, soil changes, historical records of planting on that exact slope? Or was it a judgment made from the shape of the terraces alone? This is where Djaki Kundu becomes uncomfortable. The ridge is real. The stones are real. The traditional owners associated with the place are real. But one of the main official explanations rests on a document no one can now easily check. That does not prove the explanation wrong. It does make the certainty around it feel too heavy for the support underneath. Listen to the silence around that missing file. No dramatic reveal. No neat answer. Just a gap where evidence should be, while the land itself remains in the open air, carrying its lines of stone under sun, rain, and passing traffic. Then, decades after that survey, a limited excavation put tools into the ground. What came up did not settle the matter. It made the ridge harder to explain. When archaeologist Greg Jeffries carried out a limited excavation in 2007, the ridge finally had more than surface impressions to speak through. A small cut into the site is not the same as a full investigation, but even a small cut can change the weight of a question. What he found included terrace stones exceeding 1 ton. Let that sit for a moment. 1 ton is not a stone you casually shift after lunch with a shovel and a good mood. It means planning, effort, leverage, and a reason strong enough to make the work worth doing. The sandstone would have scraped hands, dulled tools, and pressed its weight into the slope with a force you can almost feel in your knees. That does not tell us who placed the stones. It does not give the site a date. It does not turn the ridge into a solved monument. But it does make the easy version of the vineyard explanation harder to hold without more evidence. Casual farm terracing usually follows practical need. These blocks suggest a level of labor that asks for a better account. Jeffries also noted that the terraces became more pronounced toward the upper sections of the ridge. That detail matters because it pulls against a simple farming layout. Lower slopes are easier to reach. Water, soil, tools, and harvested crop all have to move somewhere. The higher the work climbs, the more deliberate the effort begins to feel. Picture the excavation trench in the heat, insects ticking in the grass, loose grit sliding under boots, a measuring tape stretched across stone. Nothing cinematic needs to happen. The shock is quiet. A heavy block appears where an ordinary explanation expected something lighter. And then the work stopped at a limited scale. No major excavation followed. So the site was left in that strange middle state, too tested to ignore, too little studied to explain. And while that uncertainty remained on the ridge, another line was being drawn toward it. The other line was not carved in sandstone, it was drawn on planning maps. The Queensland government has proposed routing a bypass highway through the site, bringing the modern world right up against a ridge whose past has never been properly settled. Road projects have their own language: corridors, alignments, upgrades, traffic flow. On paper, Those words can look clean, almost weightless. But on the ground, a road is noise, vibration, cut earth, drainage works, machines biting into soil, and survey pegs standing in the grass like small warnings. At a place like this, even a narrow disturbance can matter. The ridge sits between categories. It is visible enough to raise concern. It has an official explanation attached to it, but that explanation leans on a report people cannot now examine. It has excavation evidence, but only from a limited investigation. It is tied to Gubbi and Kabi custodianship. It is cultural. This is where uncertainty becomes dangerous. If a place is declared ordinary too early, it can be treated as expendable. If it is declared extraordinary without evidence, the real case can be weakened. Djaki Kundu sits in the harder middle, where caution should be strongest because the facts are serious and incomplete. Imagine standing below the terraces while traffic hums somewhere beyond the trees. The air smells of dry grass and bitumen after heat. A crow calls, then stops. Above you, the stones hold their old positions, heavy and silent, while a future road exists as a line waiting to become machinery. Before any bulldozer, before any final route, before anyone says the matter is settled, there is one thing still missing from the story. The kind of full investigation that could tell whether the ridge is only a farming relic or something the official record has never learned how to read. That is why the cultural setting cannot be treated as a footnote beside the stones. The ridge is associated with the Gubbi and Kabi peoples, and that changes the way the whole question has to be approached. It sits inside country. Tracks, ridges, water, trees, old pathways, and remembered places all form part of how a landscape is understood. Archaeology can measure stone, soil, and layers. Traditional custodianship holds another kind of knowledge, carried through connection and responsibility. At Djaki Kundu, those two ways of knowing should be standing beside each other. The trouble is that many old records in Queensland were written from outside that relationship. They often looked for settler uses first. Farming, mining, road access, property lines. If a terrace looked agricultural, it could be filed that way. If a ridge had a convenient explanation, the file could close before deeper questions were asked. The old paperwork has to be read with care. When the main explanation depends on a missing survey and the physical site contains heavy stonework and the traditional owners remain connected to the country, certainty should slow down. Imagine walking the slope with someone who knows the place as more than a land parcel. The air is warm. Leaves scrape softly in the scrub. The stones are underfoot, rough through the soles of your shoes. A line on a government map might call this a corridor. A cultural reading may see a place that still carries obligations. That is where the next question becomes sharper. If the ridge deserves a proper answer, what would a proper investigation actually look like? What tools would be needed before anyone could honestly say the vineyard story, the stonework, and the living custodianship had all been tested fairly? A fair investigation would begin with the ridge itself in detail, before anyone tried to force it into a tidy label. The first step would be careful mapping. Every terrace line, every break in the stonework, every change in height, every place where the slope has been cut, filled, or reshaped. The survey matters. The pattern is part of the evidence. If the terraces follow practical planting zones, that would help the agricultural case. If they form a different order, one that does not match easy access or crop use, then the old explanation would need more support. The shape has to be measured before it can be argued over. Then would come targeted excavation, wider than the small work already done. but still careful. Archaeologists would look for layers under and around the stones. They would ask whether blocks were placed all at once or over time. They would search for soil changes, charcoal, tool marks, plant traces, or any buried surface that could give the terraces a sequence. Even silence in the ground can tell a trained eye something, if the work is done properly. The stone itself could be studied too. Was it gathered from the ridge? Was any of it moved from nearby outcrops? Do the largest blocks sit where gravity left them or where hands and leverage placed them? Those questions are physical. They do not require wild claims. They require time, access, and permission. All of it would need to happen with Gubbi and Kabi involvement at the center, a place on country. The methods are plain: mapping, excavation, stone analysis, archive work, custodian-led assessment. The real tension is colder than that. The tools to read the ridge are available, while the proposed road line is still waiting on the map. The waiting line on the map is also why the story has to be kept clean. A stepped stone ridge invites big claims. The shape is strange, the paperwork is thin, and the imagination wants to rush into the empty spaces. But rushing is exactly how a real site gets damaged in public memory. If someone declares the terrace is solved without evidence, the question closes too early. If someone loads the place with fantasy, the serious case becomes easier to dismiss. The facts carry enough weight. Here is what can be said with care. The ridge stands near Gympie. Its sides carry stone terraces. It is associated with Gubbi and Kabi custodianship. A vineyard explanation exists, but its early report is unavailable. A limited excavation found stones heavier than casual farm work would easily explain. A major excavation has not yet tested the site as fully as it deserves. A bypass proposal has put modern pressure on an unresolved place. A chain of evidence and gaps. You can almost hear how different those two things are. A legend gets louder the further it moves from the ground. Evidence gets quieter. It asks you to kneel, brush soil from a stone edge, check the slope, read the file, speak to the people responsible for country, and admit when the answer is still beyond reach. The danger of wild stories is that they steal attention from the harder truth. The harder truth is plain enough to trouble anyone who cares about Australian history. A site can be visible, culturally connected, physically unusual, and still left without the full investigation that would let the public understand it. So the question becomes sharper now. If no one can honestly declare what the ridge is, why has so much confidence been allowed around what it is not? The confidence is the strange part, because the known facts do not line up neatly. Put them beside each other, and the ridge begins to look less like a solved site and more like a question that has been waiting too long. There is the location, just outside Gympie, close enough to modern roads that people can pass near it without sensing anything unusual. There is the form, stone lines climbing a sandstone rise, giving the hill that stepped outline from certain views. There is the cultural setting, Gubbi and Kabi country, where the place cannot be reduced to a blank block of land on a planning sheet. Then there is the paper trail, with its weakest and most important point. The old vineyard explanation comes from a survey that cannot now be examined by the public. No clear reason has been given. The absence sits in the story like a locked drawer. You can talk around it, you can cite what it supposedly said, but you cannot open it and check the notes. Against that absence sits the physical evidence from the limited excavation, very heavy terrace stones, some exceeding 1 ton, the kind of weight that changes your breathing when you imagine moving it, the kind of weight that asks for ropes, levers, people, time, and a purpose that has not been demonstrated. All the while, the site has never had the broad excavation that could test the competing ideas properly. The ground still holds whatever layers it holds. The stones still sit where they sit. The proposed bypass still brings the pressure of a decision closer than the comfort of an answer. This is the awe of Djaki Kundu. It has to stand there with a missing report behind it, 1-ton stones beneath it, and a road line approaching it. So before this story can close, one final question remains. When evidence is incomplete, who gets to decide that a place is ordinary enough to cut through? That decision is the real ending of this mystery, at least for now. No honest account can name the builder with certainty. No careful voice can point to the ridge and declare its purpose as if the ground has already given up every answer. What remains is stranger than a solved story. A site with visible engineering, living custodianship, heavy stonework, a thin official explanation, and a road proposal pressing near it. Djaki Kundu deserves the slow work that has not yet been done. It deserves open records, not a vanished survey carrying decades of quiet authority. It deserves proper mapping, careful excavation, and Gubbi and Kabi guidance at the center of any future study. Until then, the most accurate answer is also the most demanding one. We do not know enough. And that is not weakness. In archaeology, uncertainty can be a form of respect. It keeps the shovel careful. It keeps the file open. It keeps the bulldozer from becoming the final interpreter of a place. Picture the ridge at the end of the day. The traffic has thinned. Heat lifts from the road in soft waves. Up on the slope, the stones hold their line as the light goes amber, each terrace catching a different shade of shadow. Somewhere nearby, a planning map may still carry its clean marks and future routes, but the hill carries weight that paper cannot feel. The wisdom of this place is not hidden in a grand reveal. It is in the pause before cutting ground that has not been read. After the voices fade, the stones remain where they were, rough, warm, and patient under the Queensland sky. If this kind of evidence-led Australian archaeology is the history you want more of, stay with the channel and follow the next investigation.